It's time to talk about one of the most important scenes or sequences in any film or book. All of the first half of your story is leading up to the midpoint, which comes about 60 minutes into a film and about at page 200 in a 400-page book. The midpoint is a major shift in the dynamics of the story. It's a total game changer, and it locks the main character even more inevitably into the action of the story. Something huge will be revealed, something goes disastrously wrong, someone close to the protagonist might die or almost die. Often the whole emotional dynamic between characters changes in what Hollywood calls sex at 60. That means sex at 60 minutes, not 60 years. You'll also hear the midpoint called the point of no return, or the moment of commitment, or no going back. The main character commits irrevocably to the action. The midpoint is very often a huge defeat, which requires a huge change in plan, a recalculation, a new plan of attack. You can think of it as the tent pole of your story, or the bridge between two halves of the story. And I really want you to get this. The dynamic of the midpoint has been around since the very beginning of theater. That's thousands of years, which means your reader has seen this so often that it's an expectation that they have, even if they don't know it. Remember how in last class we were talking about how intermissions hugely influence the structure of dramatic storytelling? Playwrights always ended on a curtain scene before the intermission. They had to end each act of their play with a scene so powerful, a question so intriguing, that the audience would actually come back into the theater after they've been knocking drinks back at intermission, right? Well, very often plays are divided in half. They just have an act 1 and act 2 with one intermission between, which makes that curtain scene really important. So even though modern film and books have many more than 2 acts, the shadow of that midpoint looms large. So I want you to imagine that there's going to be an intermission halfway through your book. What's the cliffhanger that is going to bring your reader back to your story? Just to further drive the importance home, the midpoint is very often one of the most memorable visual set pieces of the story. In a movie, the filmmakers will be showing off with a massive special effects sequence, or a big action scene, or breathtaking psychological cat and mouse dialogue between unforgettable characters. In a romance, the midpoint will be a sex scene or a comedy scene, probably both. And whatever the midpoint is, it's most likely going to be specific to the promise of the genre. And I want you authors to start paying as much attention to designing your midpoints as filmmakers do. So first, I want you to identify the midpoints in some of the movies we've been talking about. What's the midpoint of Jaws? What's the midpoint of the Hunger Games? What's the midpoint of Silence of the Lambs? And then go ahead and take a stab at some of the other movies on your master list. And of course, your own story. Watch 3 or 4 or 5 midpoints in a row, and you'll start to see some of the qualities that we're looking for in a great midpoint. And while you're looking at these midpoints, I want to underscore that the midpoint is not a single moment, and sometimes it's not just a single scene either. it can be a whole progression of scenes and revelations. Sometimes you're really looking at a midpoint sequence, not a scene. So go try it, and we'll come back and talk about it a lot.